I think my camp counselor found a corpse. Author unknown. Before I start, let me preface by saying that this is actually a true story. Everything is true. This actually happened to me. Anyway, story time. Between 2003 and 2006, I went to a summer camp near where I lived. It was a day camp run by the local Jewish community center, situated in the woods just about 15 minutes outside the suburbs. The counselors were great. The woods were beautiful. Our days were always packed with one activity after the next. I even got to learn a bit about Israeli culture. I still have fond memories of the place, even though I think it went under a couple years ago. Seeing as there was a big-ass forest surrounding the camp, the counselors loved to take us on nature hikes, trailblazing, anything to get out into the woods. One of the most memorable landmarks in the woods was this one dilapidated shack, about 1 or 2 miles down the creek, past the forest eastern edge. We all affectionately called it the Witch's Shack. It was just an old shack, barely 20 by 20, but the counselors loved to tell stories to the younger kids about how, if they wandered out into the woods without a counselor, the witch would come get them. Kids weren't allowed to go into the woods without a counselor, lest you lose your snack privileges, pool privileges, or other perks. But everyone knew where it was and how to find it, since the older kids and counselors made regular trips to pick fruit from the little grove that had sprouted up near it. One day, the counselor took us, a group of my 5 friends and I, out trailblazing near the forest edge on the western end of camp. The camp had an extensive trail system in the surrounding woods, but the majority of the major trails were on the eastern end of the camp. So for the past few years, the camp owners had been trying to create some new trails along the western side. We all loved it, since they gave us all hedge trimmers and such to help clear the trail of brush, and being out in the woods was always a fun time. Working our way through the forest, I noticed something along the creek bed in the distance. At first I thought it was an uprooted tree, but a second glance showed it was actually a small shed. I immediately called to the group, "Hey, look, it's the witch's shack." My counselor looked at me confused and asked me to point it out. When he saw it too, he stood back, amazed, and suddenly I realized what he was thinking. We were at the western edge of the forest, probably 3 miles in. The witch's shack was out past the eastern edge of the forest, on the other side of camp. Now he was curious, and he said he'd go take a look. Since the trail system on the western end was so underdeveloped, we were probably the first people to be out here in years. Besides, a second witch's shack out west would deter any little would-be pioneers from heading out into the forest alone. As we approached the shack, I saw it was remarkably similar in construction to the witch's shack, and significantly less decomposed. Small 20 by 20 frame, about 8 feet high, slanted tiled roof, and a small window on one side of the shack. It almost looked like it had been used in the past few years, considering the window and roof were intact. I always wondered who lived in these before the camp bought the property. Some old rugged mudmen or something like that? At one point, our counselor told us to hang back for a bit while he checked it out. We all stood by the creek bed as we watched him poke around the shack, half expecting a witch to pop out and ice him at any moment. He tried the door, but it wouldn't open, so he worked his way around to the window. He rubbed the glass a bit and looked inside. After a second or two of squinting into the darkness, He recoiled and staggered away from the window. "Oh, fuck!" we all heard him say. Now we were intrigued too. Did he find the witch or something? We didn't get a chance to ask him, since seconds later he started ushering us back to camp. "We have to go. Now. We have to get back to camp." He was visibly panicked. "What was in the shack?" I remembered asking him. His only reply was that we had to get back to camp. When we got back, he left us by the pool and headed into the management building, a grand old mansion and camp used as their headquarters. Eventually, a counselor in training came out and took us to the rock climbing wall. We didn't see our counselor for the rest of the day. Nobody ever mentioned to us what happened in the forest, not even our own counselor. Whenever we'd ask him, he'd either brush it off or change the subject. I never did figure exactly what he saw, but I remember a couple things that give me some clues. For a couple days after this happened, police units could be seen hanging around the management building, their cruisers parked down the road, out of sight. And if they weren't strict about it before, the management, counselors, and now the cops made it crystal clear that absolutely no one is to go into the woods alone, at all, under penalty of suspension from the camp. They kept their word, too, as I remember one of my friends got suspended for doing exactly that towards the end of the summer. In a year or so, the incident was forgotten, or erased, more accurately. My counselor was fired for unspecified reasons the next year, a change we all hated. The management decided to keep the trails on the western end underdeveloped, and almost never allowed nature hikes out there again. I did get one last hike out west in, though, in an attempt to find the shack. Where it should have been, there were only a few fallen beams of wood and a tile or two from the roof. Something else in the pile of rubble caught my eye, too. Something vibrant yellow that contrasted with the brown and gray. When I dug it up, I saw it was a piece of a yellow tape with black letters printed on its side. "Don't cross. Police line." Orange Eyes, unknown author. I've never told anyone the complete details of this story. The version my family and friends know is nothing but a funny youthful misadventure. That, however, is not truth. Back when I was a kid on family road trips, I'd always look out the car window into the deep woods, just knowing that I would see Bigfoot or some other beast. At any moment, I'd see their large shapes lumbering through the brush. Now grown up, I'm usually the skeptical type. However, when you see something unexplained with your own eyes, it changes you. I was home for one weekend back in college. I was going to school 2 hours away in New Orleans. While visiting friends that Sunday night, I lost track of time. It was already 1 a.m. before I decided to drive back to the city. I called my dad before I left, and he gave me the usual warning: "Watch out for deer." That stretch of I-10, which leads to New Orleans, contains miles of thick forest and swampland. On a moonless night, like that night, you can't see 20 feet past the inky black tree line. Seeing deer having a midnight snack just off the shoulder of the road was a constant sight on those nights. The first hour of the trip was completely normal. This drive is routine at this point. I can remember every sign and exit. Each one draws me closer to my dorm room bed. Once I hit the swamps about 40 miles outside the city, a dense low-lying fog crept onto the highway. It was late at this point, and I hadn't seen another car for quite a while, but I still slowed down to be safe. It was strange that I hadn't seen any deer up to this point. Even in the fog, you can still see the shine of their eyes in your headlights. The fog must be keeping them in the woods, I supposed. Not a split second after finishing this thought did I see a pair of shining eyes in the distance. The image of what I saw next will always be burned in my mind. I saw a pair of piercing bright orange eyes. They sat at a weird height for a deer, the eyes far too big to be that of a doe. The gaze of this creature was fixed on me, unflinching. When my car finally approached, the beast moved at me. I couldn't make out its shape too well, other than it had oddly long arms and legs. The beast leapt over my car in a single pounce. It was then for a split second I saw the monster's horrible jagged teeth, yellow and fang-like, with a glimmer of bright red. Fresh blood. In the next instant I heard a loud popping noise come from my tire. The car came to an instant stop. Looking outside the passenger window, I see a large deer, dead on its side, its antlers lodged between the wheel and the car. The car wouldn't move. Getting out of the car and pulling the deer out was the only option. The fear I felt at this point still makes me sick to my stomach. The next thing I know, I'm already out of the car, yanking on the deer's antlers, which have completely shredded my tire. Looking down at the carcass, it appears to be completely hollowed out. Not only was the deer missing its organs, I noticed there was very little blood left. I can hear my heart pounding in my head as I struggle to dislodge the antlers. That's when I look up, and I see the orange eyes racing at me. They moved at a furious pace. Giving the deer one last successful tug, I fly into the car through the passenger door. Crawling over to the driver's seat, I slam the car into drive and hit the gas hard. The tires screeched to life. The eyes disappeared in the taillights through my rearview mirror. My tire rim was completely deformed by the time I made it to the next exit. It had to be towed back to the city. I sat in complete silence the entire ride home on the wrecker, still in shock. The next day on the phone, my dad must have sensed something was wrong in my voice. He was very understanding, even though to him I ignored his warning to watch out for deer. "Looks like the antlers completely ruined the tire," he said calmly. "We'll have to replace the whole thing." "I understand," I responded. "It's the other damage I just don't understand." "Dad, what other damage?" I asked. I wasn't ready for what he said next. "The scratches. You have 5 very deep scratches on your truck." The only answer I could produce was, "Okay." Since that day, I will never make that drive at night, terrified of what I may see deep in the forest. I no longer go hunting by myself. I do not know what I saw, but I do know it was something that should not have been there, and it will remain with me the rest of my life. I was turkey hunting one morning, approximately 4 years ago. I have never told my story due to I feel people will not believe me. It rained all night long that night, and thus it allowed me to walk into the forest in complete silence, no leaves crackling. I set up on a hill, overlooking a small creek and valley. It was nearly pitch black due to the overcast sky, but soon the rain stopped and the forest became brighter. Soon after, I realized I was sitting within 15 feet of several birds that were roosted in a tree next to me. I didn't know they were there until they started shaking the rain off. My gun was already propped on my knee and pointed at my decoy. As things became brighter, I could make out most of the valley floor, and I continued to watch the birds roosted next to me. Soon after, one of the birds gobbled. I began hearing something off in the distance, almost immediately after. I only remember this because it was a very strange pace sound. The rhythm of it seemed odd. Nothing I could think of would make a sound like this. I could see down the valley to my right for a fairly long distance. However, to my left, a separate hillside came out, and I could not see up the valley in that direction. The noise continued with almost near perfect rhythm for several minutes, with only occasional breaks. It continued to get louder. I soon realized the sound I was hearing was coming from up the valley in the direction I could not see. The turkeys in their roost next to me stopped gobbling and remained silent. A few moments later, the forest was becoming fairly bright, and I could see most everything around me. All of the birds roosted in the tree flew down and hit the forest floor running. They didn't even seem to notice the decoy. I remained perfectly still, watching the birds run through the forest, down to my right through the valley. They acted as though something spooked them. At first I thought maybe it was me that spooked them, but then it occurred to me the sound had stopped about the same time the birds took off. As soon as the birds were out of sight, the noise began again. I remained still, leaning against a large ash tree. Maybe 1 minute after I lost sight of the birds, the sound was becoming much louder and apparent of what it might be. My first instinct was that another hunter was walking through the forest. However, to this day, I will never forget what I saw in the coming moments. The sound with an almost steady rhythm reminded me of what it would sound like if I were walking on dry leaves in the forest. There was not a drop of wind on this morning, and I believe the valley might have been echoing the sound. A few moments later I caught sight of it, maybe 50 yards to my left, coming into view on the bottom edge of the valley. At first I thought it was a hunter in a ghillie suit, but upon closer examination, I realized this was no human wearing a camo outfit. It continued to walk upright on 2 feet down the valley towards my right. When the creature got to the bottom of the hill outcropping I was sitting on, it stopped dead in its tracks and remained perfectly still momentarily. I think it was at this point I truly realized what I was seeing. When it stopped and stood still, it became nearly invisible in the forest. It seemed an eternity passed while I sat against this tree, uncontrollably shaking. I was scared out of my wits, even with a 10-gauge shotgun propped on my knee, pointed in the direction of the creature. What happened next scared me so bad I would have bet my life that I was going to have a heart attack. The creature turned its head and looked directly at me. I stared directly into the eyes of this creature for an unknown amount of time. It made no sound. It did not move, only stared at me. I was in full camouflage, including a face mask, so maybe it was not sure what I was. Shaking so bad at this point, the only thing I could think of was to defend myself. I clicked the safety off of the shotgun. When I did this, the creature went into an almost crouching position, only it seemed more like it was in a position that would allow it to move quickly. The stare down went on for what seemed forever. I readied my shotgun, not afraid to move anymore, since it was apparent I had been seen. When I positioned my left hand under the forearm of my shotgun, the creature sprang up, nearly causing me to pull the trigger. It continued to walk through the forest with its head turned, watching me. I continued pointing my gun at it. I never pulled the trigger. I was so afraid I didn't know what to do. Eventually, I lost sight of it. I jumped up as soon as it was gone, and I ran back to my truck without stopping to rest once. To this day, I will never forget what I saw or the feeling of absolute terror that overcame me. I do not want to be famous, nor do I want my story posted all over the internet. I just thought I should tell somebody my story. Everything I have just read is entirely true. Stories from the Backwoods, Late Night Hunter. Before I get started, I want you all to know that I live in a somewhat isolated area of Wisconsin, surrounded by forest and farmland. This first story happened about 7 months ago. It was midsummer, and I was driving home from my girlfriend's house. It was around 11 at night, and I was driving down a back road, as I often do, because I can go faster without the worry of the occasional cop driving past. Anyhow, I was driving down the road, doing about 65 or 70 miles an hour, when I came to an area with an open field on the right and dense forest on the left. Between the moon and the stars, I could see the field pretty well. I saw 2 figures moving in the field, running towards the road. Deer aren't uncommon out here, so I thought nothing of it. Normally, a quick honk or two will scare the deer into running the opposite direction, but this time it didn't. The first figure bolts across the road. A deer, just like I thought. The second figure stops and cuts back in the opposite direction. The problem was that this one was different. It was much bigger than a deer, and it seemed to run different. I slammed on the brakes and hopped out of my truck. Looking back now, I don't know why I did that. Logically, it didn't make sense. I walked around to the passenger side of the truck, hoping to see something moving in the field. No luck. That's when I heard it. To this day, I still can't find the words to describe it properly. It sounded like an animal in pain. A piercing sound that made my blood run cold. I froze. Even in my head, I remember saying, "Get back in the truck. Get out of here." But I couldn't move. I heard the cry one more time. It cut off abruptly. I slowly stepped backwards, not wanting to turn my back on the field. I got back in the truck and locked all the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to control my breathing. I put the truck in drive and kept going, convinced that what I heard was just some trick of the night and the adrenaline pumping through my veins. As I pulled away, I looked back in the rearview mirror. Maybe it was the fear, but I will swear to this day that I saw something walk out of the woods onto the road and watch as I drove away. Even today, I can't drive down that stretch of road without feeling like I'm being watched from the woods. Anyone who has felt that way knows what I mean. That knot in your stomach, the feeling of wanting to run as fast as you can, yet not being able to move. The cold that penetrates every part of your body. The Hunter by the Prowler. The Sasquatch phenomenon has been dying down recently, it seems. At least that's what people tell me. They say it's just a hoax. If they were real, then why haven't we seen one by now? Come across a body in the woods or something. Well, friends, What happened to me just a month ago would shake the shit out of your hole, slide down your leg, and rest at your feet in a pool of terror. I've been a hunter for over 30 years, you see. These woods don't contain nothing I haven't seen, or so I thought. It happened on Saturday the 14th, like I said, a month back. I loaded up my truck with my essentials and my dog Roscoe, and we headed up to the mountains. A very particular spot, as a matter of fact. A place I've been going to since I was in short pants. I'm telling you, friends, this was the best spot to hunt in all of Washington State. This was like my second home. My peepaw taught me everything I knew, right at this very spot. And I've never seen anything strange in all my days of coming out here. After about an hour in the truck, I arrived at my site. It was just as beautiful as I remembered, but for some reason, I don't know why, seemed off. There was a strangeness in the air. I feel stupid thinking back on it now. I should have known something wasn't right about the woods that day. It was quiet, too damn quiet. And my boy Roscoe wouldn't even get out of the damn truck. He just laid there whimpering up against the passenger door. He's never done that before. Roscoe was the best hunting dog I've ever had. I should have been paying attention, damn it. He knew. He could smell it in the air, I know it. But sadly, my dumbass wasn't paying attention. So I got some food out, and that got Roscoe to come out of the truck. Then I set up the tent, collected some wood for fire later on, and got the rest of my supplies out of the truck. The sun was still out, so I wanted to get some hunting in right away. I grabbed my rifle, and me and Roscoe started out. Now, like I said, up till this point I hadn't noticed shit, but I finally went on the alert when I saw scratch marks on a few of the trees leading away from my campsite. It looked like bear marks to me, so my guard was definitely up at this point. We continued into the forest when we finally happened upon a deer drinking in the stream. I raised my rifle, one to the head, and it fell over dead. I sent old Roscoe to go and secure the body, but to my surprise he just stopped, halfway to the carcass, and he just sat there. I ran over and looked down at him, and he was sniffing, just sniffing the lightly blowing breeze. Right when I was about to say, "What are you smelling, boy?" it hit me. It was the most putrid thing that's ever hit my nostrils in my entire life. It was a combination of shit, rotten eggs, and a homeless old woman that's been lying dead for 2 weeks before someone's found her. I got sick right on the spot, but in the middle of me blowing chunks, I heard Roscoe start to growl. I looked up, and coming towards the deer's body was one of the biggest damn bears I've ever seen. It bent down and sank its teeth in its hind leg. I crouched down to pick up my rifle, but when I did, I heard a loud snap. Damn it, I stepped on a twig, I thought. I slowly looked back up towards the bear, and it was now staring right back at me. It started towards me and Roscoe, but right when it was about to take off at full speed towards us, the loudest roar I've ever heard in my whole life came from the bushes just to the left of the bear. I swear to God, it was so loud it swayed the trees. I could feel it vibrate my boots. I stopped and looked towards the bushes. The bear stopped and looked towards the bushes. And I shit you not, what emerged was a 7-foot-tall, hairy-as-hell, ape-like creature. Everything that's ever been described was looking right at me and the bear. It was a damn Sasquatch. No ifs, ands, or buts. I was looking at the legendary creature. I stood in amazement as the Sasquatch leapt from the bushes and tore the bear's jaw clean off its head and started to eat it. Just then I heard Roscoe start to growl, and that lifted me out of my trance. All at once it hit me. The putrid smell, the bear, the damn Sasquatch. I just stared at the woodland beast eating its prey. But now its head started to rise, and it slowly looked into my eyes, sniffing in my direction. I could hear it growl in the distance. Just then Roscoe barked. I snapped back into reality. I told Roscoe to follow, turned and ran back towards the truck. I heard splashing from behind me as it crossed the stream. I ran and ran as fast as I could, but it followed. The whole forest shook as it ran after me. Thankfully, I was well enough ahead and lost him in the bushes. Got in the truck, and me and Roscoe got the hell out of there. Haven't been back since. Gee, mister, that's a real spooky story and all. But we know you're just trying to scare us. You just don't want us going up the mountain and partying in your woods. Please, kids, this ain't no joke. Turn this car around and go to one of those more crowded, family-oriented camping sites. I'm begging you. Thanks, mister, for your concern. But we're not kids. We'll be fine. You take care now. Bye. That was 2 weeks ago, and those dumb-ass kids are still missing. I warned them, didn't I, Roscoe? They're not gonna find them. Hell, there's probably nothing left. Damn it, nobody believes me. Why doesn't anybody believe me? Wendigo Encounter. Anonymous author. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I'm scared shitless. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son, and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost part of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and instead of confiscating our weapons, told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself, there's no way. They're effing with us, but I knew better. So we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby carrying backpacks, and my son started to get heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if someone had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint, rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as if it knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have said,
"I need more children."
My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what had happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be older, by at least a decade, pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly some rangers came into the cabin saying they couldn't find our son. My girlfriend started to sob. I start to hate myself, thinking that I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened, or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we don't have a son anymore. God help whoever goes into that forest next. And please, please, don't bring your kids with you. Don't follow the whistling. Author unknown. As a kid growing up in Louisiana, I spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, fishing, just standard things. There's lots of legends and tales of these woods, a lot of which come from my grandfather. Once I got old enough to travel the woods alone, he started telling me of these legends. Petey Peepon was one of them. I was old enough to believe that the story of Petey Peepon was just something he made up to mess with me. It sounded pretty ridiculous after all. He told me if I ever heard a whistling out in the woods, not to follow it, or Petey Peepon would take me away. Standard ghost story stuff. Early one morning, before the sun had risen, I was out in the woods. I was sitting on a log, waiting for the sun to come up so I could begin my squirrel hunt, listening for any sign of tree branches moving or acorns hitting the ground. It can be pretty peaceful. I used to live for those moments. The cool early morning air, the silence of the woods. It's a fantastic experience. Once the sun had come up, for me to see without the help of a light, I stood up and started to really survey the area, deciding on which direction I would go. I wasn't worried about staying close to the camp. At the time, I was 14, and my dad had instilled upon me basic survival instincts. I knew to keep in mind what direction the sun was to me when I started walking, and to put it to the opposite side when I returned. Depending on the time of day, of course. I had never gotten lost by doing just that. After walking a good 5 miles, stopping to bag a few squirrels along the way, I came across a small clearing and decided to rest for a minute. The woods had gotten silent, so I guessed that since nothing was moving, it would be best to stop and wait for signs of squirrels. I first heard the whistle from my right. It wasn't a whistle someone does when they're trying to get your attention, more like someone whistling a song. What kind of idiot is walking around whistling when people are trying to hunt? I heard the whistling coming closer, and I could tell whoever this was coming right where I was sitting. Out in the woods, we don't like to yell at each other, so we just make this whooping noise. It's kind of the universal "I'm over here" signal. Whoop! I was hoping that whoever was coming my way would take the hint and either leave or stop whistling. At least whoop back to me. However, they did not. I couldn't hear them coming any closer, but they just kept whistling. I stand up from my log and look in the direction of the whistling. I couldn't see anyone there. Putting it off as someone who spent way too much on fancy camouflage, I decided to yell out, "Hey, I'm trying to hunt over here." Still, the whistling keeps going. Getting very irritated, I started walking towards the whistling so I could tell this idiot to shut up. I walked a good 500 yards and never saw anyone. I stopped to scratch my head and wonder if I was going crazy when I heard the whistling again, this time behind me. Now I'm thinking it's my cousin messing with me. He was next to me the night my grandfather was telling me about the things in the woods, and he knew my hunting spot. I walked back that direction saying, "Rhett, if that's you, I swear to God I'm gonna kill you." I wasn't worried about hunting anymore. I just wanted to know who was messing with me. I get back to where the clearing was, and it wasn't there. It's like the trees just magically grew back, and I was more confused than I had ever been in my life. Whistling from my right this time. At this point, I realize I have no idea where I am. Nothing looks right anymore. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that someone moved all the trees around when I walked away. By that time, I realized that I needed to get out of there. My stomach sank when I realized that, at this time, the sun was in the middle of the sky. I had no way of knowing which way to go. I felt confused and extremely lost. I could hear the whistling coming from behind me again. I started walking in the opposite direction of the whistling, hoping I could get away from whatever was causing it. I walked about 5 minutes when the whistling started coming from in front of me and was getting closer. I remembered I had a gun and stood my ground. I didn't see any other way of getting out of there. I saw only what I can describe as a blurry figure walking towards me. When I say blurry, I mean that it was like my eyes just refused to focus on whatever this thing was walking towards me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, nothing helped. It was just a black, blurry blob in the form of a human. I fired at it and heard this horrible screech, something I can only describe as microphone feedback, but so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I took off running and just didn't stop. I managed to find a deer trail and started following it. Things started to look familiar at that point, and I started seeing used shotgun shells on the ground. They looked like mine, and when I realized that, I remembered where I was. I followed the deer trail back to the camp, where my dad and grandpa was. When my dad saw me, he started screaming at me, asking where I was and why I hadn't came back to the camp. I asked him what he meant. I had only been gone a few hours, and why were they back so early? I never came back to the camp that night. I had been gone for almost a full day. I decided not to tell them about what happened, mostly because I knew there was no way my dad would believe me. I made up a story that I had gotten lost and just camped out in the woods that night. I wasn't allowed to hunt alone for a while. That night, as we're sitting around the fire, my dad left to answer nature's call, and my grandpa said, "You followed the whistling, didn't you?" I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.